Hi everyone, thank you for joining me for another video. So this time we're going to go a little bit deep into what it means to have a concept or a feeling of a separate self and a separate other, because you can't have a separate self without a separate other. So I guess in spirituality we talk about this illusion of a separate self or illusion of a separate ego, same thing. And so how does this really arise? Well, it's kind of a feeling or a concept that we have inside us, that inside the body generates this feeling of, hey, I'm a separate this thing, and it kind of delineates a certain thing. It's like everything within this is me and everything outside of it is other stuff. Basically, we just take that for granted, like it's real, like we're a real separate self and there's a real separate other stuff. So this illusion of separate self or ego and the separate other always arises together. And because the self and other arises together, we call this dualism. So two things, in reality it's two or more things, but there has to be at least two things, and we call that dualism. So that all starts when you feel like a separate self and there's stuff that isn't the separate self. Dualism. So that's the way that we operate out of normally in our everyday kind of lives, and we don't really think about it. We don't think there's an alternative way of being. We just think that's it, and we don't even consider anything else. We don't even give it a name. But for the sake of talking about it, let's call that normal way of thinking or being a separate self. Let's call that dualism. In spirituality, we talk about this illusion being an illusion, and that it's just temporary. And when this illusion of separate ego does dissolve, then so does the feeling of other. So when when you have a kind of like a deep peak spiritual experience, and the sense of separate self and other dissolves, what is really left? Well, that's the thing that we don't have a good way to describe, but people try to describe this feeling as a kind of feeling of oneness, of just one thing, and that, there's no sense of self there, this kind of deep spiritual experience. So there's many words to describe this thing, oneness, or however you want to think about it, but it's really kind of like a non thing. It's just this, whatever is here, this experience. One of the popular words we have is to describe it as the negation of dualism. So we talked about dualism being the feeling of separate self and other. So if we negate dualism, what is left? Well, one way to describe that is non-dualism. So it's like we don't even point to that thing because we can't even describe it. So we just say that it's what's there when there's no dualism. So this feeling of oneness. So this non-dual kind of oneness is something that's so hard to describe, impossible to describe, that it's best if we feel it directly. And a lot of us who are on a spiritual path are often seeking this feeling of to directly feel this non-dual experience, because that is the only way to fully kind of understand it, is by feeling it directly rather than talking about it, even though it's fun to talk about. So this is really what's already there, what's always there, and always will be, the one true reality, the kind of direct experience before we add any kind of illusion of separation to it. And that's beginning with the feeling of separate self and separate other. So where does the separate self and other even come from in the first place? Well, it's something, the body being a body creates this kind of ego illusion, because through fear it believes that this feeling will help it survive. Sort of through evolution, this feeling of separate self has come up. It's kind of like an evolutionary trait, just like your hands and your ears and your eyes have evolved over time. So has this feeling of separate self evolved in the brain structures of humans and probably many other animals. So it's just an evolutionary trait, just this feeling of separate self helps us survive in certain conditions, and that's that. So there's a kind of flip side to this though, because if this kind of mechanism of feeling like a separate self is always triggered, it becomes permanently kind of switched on most of the time. And so we're always living out of this feeling of a separate self. And that can be very painful. You don't even realize it, how much of our dissatisfaction comes from this mechanism of feeling like a separate self being switched on all the time to turned up to maximum level 10. It's a painful, it brings us a lot of pain over time, and we don't even think about it because it just becomes the background of our life, and it seems like everybody else has this, and it seems like such a real solid thing. Yeah, of course I'm here, this is me, I'm a separate thing, and there's other stuff over there. It feels so solid. We never question it. We never question how much of our suffering comes from this mechanism being dialed up permanently. So then, what do we do about this? Well, I guess your spiritual practice of choice, there's no right or wrong. There's 8 billion different spiritual practices. But when we following a true spiritual practice to seek the truth, whether it's devotional or philosophical, we're always looking at trying to just dial down that feeling of a separate self, and to continuously touch the non-dual, touch the direct experience, and forgetting about this self-created illusion of a separate self, just forgetting about it, just dialing that down as often as possible, getting back to the base experience before we add that illusion to it. We do this, try to do this as frequently as possible, whether it's through meditation, through devotion, just continuously dial that down. And over time, this helps us to realize that, hey, there's a different way of being than this kind of separate self illusion all the time. And it's a very healthy thing to do. It brings us back to the direct experience, and keeps all our nervous system, everything kind of just balanced and relaxed, rather than pushing itself so hard and stressing itself out. And occasionally we may even have a kind of a peak experience of this reality, which really kind of blows our mind. We see something really directly. Oftentimes it's at a moment where we're very, very sucked into our egos. We've dialed up our ego, our sense of self to 11, and then suddenly, bang, it's switched to 0. And that happens so quickly that suddenly, wow, we're just like astounded by this direct experience that comes flooding in. And that just often lasts for a short time. But even just the simple mindfulness experience of just getting back to the moment, dissolving and dialing down that sense of self, and just dissolving into the moment and experience for what it is really what we aim for in all of our spiritual practices. Just getting back to the moment. And the more we practice this, getting back to the moment, mindfulness, meditation, whatever path you choose, along this path, it seems that the strongest emotions, the strongest ones which really pull ourselves into our self, our ego, and strengthen our ego, a lot of these strong emotions, whether they're good and pleasurable, or whether they're dark or desires or anything like that, these naturally kind of lose their grip over time on the body and the mind. So more and more, the mind finds it will not need to be permanently stuck in the dualism illusion, permanently with that dial turned up to 10 on the sense of self. So more and more, we become free. So that's my take on the separate self and other, the illusion of separate self and other, how it arises, and why we practice to turn that thing down a little once in a while. Thank you for joining me, and if you've got any questions or comments about anything I've said, feel free to leave that below, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.